Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Richard Kinley, president of FOGS, the Foundation on Global Governance and Sustainability, and in a former life, a staff member official of the UN Climate Secretariat. We at FOGS are really delighted today to be hosting this panel discussion on the themes of President Biden's climate summit of last week, and what it means for the achievement of the 1.5 degree temperature threshold goal from the Paris Agreement and the impacts it could have on COP26 in Glasgow later this year. We've now got a week under our belts since the summit took place. It gives time for the dust to settle, and I think it's a pretty good time to take stock. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you who have joined us either on Zoom or on Facebook for what I'm really hopeful will be an informative and engaging discussion amongst a really impressive group of panelists who I must say I'm delighted have agreed to join us. So with that, I would now introduce our panel. And first and foremost, thanking them most wholeheartedly for giving their time to the discussion today and for sharing their insights on this really interesting and important topic. First off, and a really warm thanks to our moderator for today, Palita Clark. Palita is an associate editor and business columnist at the Financial Times and a very well-informed climate commentator. So Palita, we're really thrilled that you have agreed to help us today. And I'm really looking forward to the way you are going to grill our distinguished panel members shortly. Then in terms of our panelists, first I would introduce Alison Campbell, who is the Deputy COP Envoy of the United Kingdom's COP26 presidency team. Welcome, Alison. We have Monica Dean, a senior advisor to John Kerry at the US State Department. And Monica was intimately involved in organizing the summit last week. So welcome, Monica. We have Nicholas Heune, who is a founding partner of the New Climate Institute and a professor at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Welcome, Nicholas. Lee Shaw is a senior global policy advisor for Greenpeace East Asia. Welcome, Lee Shaw. Yusuf Nassef, former colleague of mine. Welcome, Yusuf, director of adaptation and the director in charge of intergovernmental process management at the UN Climate Secretariat. And last, but definitely not least, Jennifer Tolman, a senior policy advisor on climate diplomacy and geopolitics at the international think tank E3G. Before I hand over the control, or the gavel, as we used to say, to Palita, I would just note that there is the possibility for those of you who are viewing on Zoom or Facebook to submit questions for the panel members. In Zoom, if you could please use the chat function, and in Facebook, the comment section. Our team will be keeping an eye on these and will try to take them on board, but I have to apologize from the outset that depending on how vigorous the panel discussion is, it may be that some of the questions would not be able to be taken on board. And one final point from me, we're aiming to post a recorded version of the panel discussion tomorrow so that you can watch it again and again and again, or even better, recommend it to your friends and colleagues. And this will be on the FOGS.org website as well as the FOGS Facebook page. So without further ado, I would pass the responsibility to Palita and invite you to kick off the discussion.
Well, thanks so much, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be here today with such a knowledgeable panel of speakers. And as you say, just 1 week on from a very unusual climate meeting. The Biden summit was the first of its kind ever convened by a US president. And of course, we saw it brought forth a number of extremely interesting pledges, not least from the US itself, which is now committed to roughly halving its emissions by 2030. But the real question is, what did the summit actually achieve? Has it really brought us any closer to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement? And will it have any impact at all on the COP26 meeting due in November? So these are the main questions that we want to look at today. We know that all of you watching will have many, many more, and we're very much looking forward to getting to all of them. But first, let's just look at what happened at the summit itself. And Monica, as Richard said, you were actually involved in the exercise, which was obviously a mighty logistical event in its own right. Could you just briefly explain what your role was, and then tell us what, from your perspective, was the biggest achievement of the summit overall?
Sure, thanks, Polita, and thanks so much to FOG for inviting me to join this panel today. So I was part of the State Department team working along with our colleagues throughout the administration involved with planning the summit and organizing all of the wonderful sessions and activities that everyone saw virtually. And to that end, I would say that the summit was quite the achievement, personal bias aside. So I think the summit did two big things. One, it demonstrated to the world that America is back. And two, that we're committed to rallying the world for greater climate ambition. On the first point, starting on day one, President Biden fulfilled his promise to rejoin the Paris Agreement. A week later, we had the Climate Executive Order, which directed the US to prepare a new NDC, a climate finance plan, and it also set forth this commitment to organize the Leader Summit, all by Earth Day, less than 100 days later, right? And the summit delivered across the board on all of those, obviously on organizing the Leader Summit itself, but also on fulfilling our commitment to announce an ambitious new NDC, as you mentioned, of having economy-wide emissions reduction in 2030. It also fulfilled the commitment to announcing our new international climate finance plan, which included our intent to double by 2024 our public climate finance to developing countries, and also our intention to triple our adaptation finance. And so I think when combined, all of these pledges show that not only are we committed to getting the US on the right path, but that we're committed to creating unprecedented economic opportunities. For those of you who watched President Biden's joint address last night, he kept saying jobs, jobs, jobs. And that's exactly our approach, is that all of these actions create new economic opportunities, not just here at home, but also for everyone. For every country addressing the climate crisis, there are economic opportunities. And so to that end, I would say that the second part of our accomplishment, the second part of the summit that we accomplished, was the raising global ambition, right? And so since the start, President Biden made it clear, we cannot confront this crisis alone. And so the Leader Summit was the culmination of a strong diplomatic campaign led by the Special Envoy, Secretary Kerry, and many others of my colleagues at the State Department, to ensure enhanced emission reduction targets and innovative adaptation efforts. And I would say on that front, we were also successful. We were successful at getting the world to show up for climate. We hosted the largest virtual convening of world leaders with attendance by 40 heads of state, including the world's 17 largest economies. But on top of that, Secretary Kerry also hosted 2 ministerial roundtables with over 60 other countries. That means in the course of 2 days, we convened nearly 100 countries, all showcasing their commitment and the urgency of addressing the climate crisis and their resolve in doing so. And I think it's that ambition.
It's such an interesting point. I mean, it really did show the convening power of the president is obviously still there. But one person who did show up was President Xi from China. And that was a really interesting point because, of course, the US is only the second biggest emitter in the world, and the biggest at the moment is China, has been for some time. I just wonder if I can just go now to Li Shuo and just ask you, Li Shuo, ahead of the summit, a lot of people were expecting or hoping that President Xi might have actually improved on or given some update on the 2060 carbon neutrality goal announced last year. He didn't do that. But he did say that China would strictly limit the increase in coal use in the near future and phase it down after 2025. And a lot of people thought that was super significant. I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Palita. I think first of all, it's probably important to put the president's speech on the night of the 22nd into context. Many of you may know that China committed last year to carbon neutrality by 2060, and in the meanwhile also incrementally enhanced all of its 4 numerical targets for 2030. And since then, these announcements have triggered a lot of domestic discussions, not only in Beijing at the central government level, but also, among our provinces, but also the private sector. So in a way, I do see that over the past less than a year, the climate discussion here in China has advanced. I think it is also important to, of course, mention that before the April 22nd summit, the US climate envoy, John Kerry, paid a visit to Shanghai. And as a result of that visit, there was a US-China joint statement on climate crisis. And the overall tone from that joint statement is very cooperative. So I do think that provides a basis for these two countries to work together in the future. And that's not something that we could simply take for granted, given the very contentious nature of the bilateral relationship. But going back to your question, Palita, in terms of what the president said on the 22nd, I think in a way it is noteworthy that this is the first time that he has mentioned in the international setting coal, the issue of coal, single that issue out because this is where the lion's share of China's energy comes from. And there's no climate solution if we don't tackle that. But on the other hand, to peak coal consumption, which is what he said, is somewhat already embedded in China's previous commitment, particularly the one to peak China's overall CO2 emissions before 2030. For you to achieve that, you have to, of course, peak coal before 2025. So in a way, it's a modest announcement. It highlighted coal, but clearly we will still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, another point that he made, President Xi, in his speech, which really didn't receive very much attention, was that he urged developed countries to refrain from green trade barriers. And Jennifer, I want to bring you in here because in Europe, that was seen as very much a message to Brussels not to proceed or to be very careful about proceeding with its plans for a carbon border tax. And I just wonder, do you think the EU is wise to be pushing ahead with this very contentious plan, given its history of trying to bring in these sorts of measures to press outside countries to take action? And could it actually end up jeopardizing or promoting the global climate agenda?
I think there is a lot that needs to be considered that is only just really reaching the attention of Brussels, of the Brussels political sphere. We've seen the CBAM emerge very much as an answer to a domestic problem that has potential international benefits, but also significant international risks once it becomes concrete. So for a long time, the political sphere in Brussels was really wielding CBAM as a bit of a stick, a potential, there will be trade consequences, we do have teeth.
And when you say CBAM, for those who...
yes, sorry.
Carbon border adjustment mechanism, AKA carbon border tax, correct?
Correct. That is the wonky Brussels abbreviation for this trade measure that they are proposing. But as we advance from this,
goods coming in from countries that don't have, say, as high a carbon price as the EU, perhaps, or will actually attract some sort of levy.
Well, it really depends. I think this is the problem. As we're heading towards a proposal, it's actually very unclear what shape it will take until we see that proposal in June. So there are questions around, is it some form of levy? There are questions around what is the scope? Is it just cement, steel, electricity, which obviously just implicates a certain number of countries, particularly within the EU neighborhood? Or is it broader? Is agriculture part of that? That isn't the indication that we're seeing, but that would have much broader implications for EU trade partners. And then the final question is obviously also what happens with the resources. Now, as I was saying, this has very much come about as a bit of a domestic proposition with little consideration for the international landscape that it is landing in until recently. And one of the big questions is what happens with any money that, if it takes a levy form, that levy would generate. Is it something that just gets sucked back into the EU machinery, or is it something that goes towards supporting energy transitions in partner countries, that goes towards supporting them being able to meet the standards of production or you know, electricity produced, cement produced, steel produced in the EU, and therefore at some point be able to be exempt from this form of levy? What is the intentionality of this? I think that's the question that we've had a lot of partners asking.
Yeah. Either way, it's fairly clear that China's not going to be very happy with it, it seems. Alison, I just wonder if I can just put a question to you. There's another aspect of the summit. As we've discussed, we saw a number of really interesting pledges coming forward, particularly from the US. However, a number of countries also turned up, my native one amongst them, Australia, also Russia, Indonesia, Mexico. A number really didn't make any significant pledges or new pledges at all. And I just wonder, what is the UK hoping or planning to do between now and November's COP26 meeting to change that?
Thank you, and thanks to Richard and the team for having me on this panel as well. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the focus of our efforts towards COP26. You know, we've got 6 months to go now. We've just had the US summit, which, you know, I think, as Monica said, was a really important step and a really important moment to kind of build the political momentum and political will, because that's what's going to be, you know, really important as we go towards COP26, that leaders engage in this and really look at how they can increase ambition. I think, you know, you've mentioned that we saw a, you know, strong showing from the NDC commitments, the 2030 targets from the G7. And I think that is really important because, you know, we have been saying both as COP president and as president of the G7, you know, that it is the responsibility of the G7 to kind of be putting our best foot forward and taking the lead. And I think the signal that it now sends to other countries that we have all of the G7 with their net zero targets on the table, with 2030 NDCs on the table that are aligned with that, and, you know, having increased ambition, you know, between 10 and 20% from Paris. I think that's really important, and then it allows us to go into that conversation with some of those other countries that you talked about on a much stronger footing. Because, you know, we are very clear as COP president that we need to leave Glasgow keeping 1.5 degrees in reach. That does mean, of course, the G7 and other developed countries acting. It also means, you know, some of the middle income countries. It means all countries increasing ambition towards COP. And so, you know, we will continue through our diplomacy to kind of send those messages and to try and kind of put forward the narrative that Monica also said came very strongly from the US summit, which is this is also about, you know, opportunity and jobs. So I think that's one important element. I think another kind of important aspect to this that we haven't discussed so far, and especially when we get to some of the countries that you mentioned, is the need to also show progress on finance and adaptation. You know, I think the conversation has focused on the mitigation side so far. But we are also clear as COP president that, you know, we need to step up as donors to deliver the 100 billion, and we need to show that the finance is flowing and give kind of countries confidence that support is available and that we're all moving on this transition together. So yes, you know, we didn't see every single country move at the Biden summit. I would have been incredibly impressed with Monica and the diplomacy team in the US if that had happened. We had our own climate ambition summit back in December, and we saw that as a step in the road when we had, you know, 75 countries come forward with NDCs. I think the US summit has added to that, and it's added to the momentum and that political will. And we have, you know, 6 months left and another, you know, number of other steps on the road, you know, through our G7 presidency, through the Commonwealth Summit, the G20, through UNGA, the UN General Assembly, and at COP26 itself. And I think, you know, we just need to keep pushing for progress through each of those steps as we move to COP26.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Just a reminder to everyone, please do send in your questions. Just type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, everybody watching, and we'll be endeavouring to take as many of them as we can throughout the conversation. But Yusuf, let me turn to you. In February, your boss, Patricia Espinosa, the UN's top climate official, put out a report showing where countries were up to in terms of their pledges for the Paris Agreement. And she was very critical of the fact that they were nowhere near the stage needed to meet those goals. I just wonder, in the wake of the summit, are things in the office feeling a little more easy? Are you more optimistic now, or is it in some ways perhaps even made your job harder?
No, certainly more optimistic, Pelita. I mean, it's important to see what's the objective prescribed by the science, which is 45% reduction compared to 2010 by 2030. And that's our sort of threshold that we're measuring everything against. During this COVID year, I mean, which started last year, obviously, our hope is that all of these political moments can help push slightly towards that goal in the end. So we had in the beginning of the year, there was an adaptation summit, then we have the Ministerial for Climate Action, then we had the summit, President Biden's summit, then next week we'll have Petersburg, there will be the UNGA, there's probably going to be something there on climate change. And so every one of these gives a push or a chance, a platform for more announcements to be made, for coalitions to be forged, for initiatives that bring us closer. So certainly the biggest leap in ambition that we've seen has been out of the Biden summit. And certainly we are feeling more optimistic as we move towards the COP. We will have another report coming up late in September with all the new up-to-date information submitted till the end of July. And then anything submitted after the end of July that did not make its way to that revised report will still have an opportunity for another addendum to come by the time of the COP. So we're hopeful that this number keeps moving as we move forward, certainly bolstered considerably by the announcement from the summit last week, and hopefully we're in the right direction. So yes, optimistic.
All right, very good. Well, you mentioned the word science. Nicholas, you have been following the UN climate negotiations forever, I think since something like 1995. You've contributed to several IPCC reports. You created the Climate Action Tracker, which keeps an eye on the pledges, the NDCs, as we say in the jargon that Yusuf just mentioned. Can you tell us what this summit has done in terms of making it easier to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Pelita, and thanks, Richard, for the invitation to be here. A great panel. I have the privilege to show a few slides, if I may. So if we can show that. Indeed, we look at this for quite a while, and usually it's frustrating business. But now things are really moving, and it's the first time since I'm looking at this that we have good news, which is really nice after that many years. What I'm showing here is a few slides from the project Climate Action Tracker, which is a project that we at New Climate Institute are doing together with Climate Analytics. And well, we look at what's happening globally. So here you see the global greenhouse gas emissions in the past years. They have gone up, unfortunately, in the past. But where they have to go is to go down for 1.5 degrees, which is, well, the goal or one of the goals of the Paris Agreement. You can see it's a drastic change. It's halving global emissions from now until 2030, or the minus 45% that Yusuf mentioned. It's that order of magnitude. It's not nothing. It's halving global emissions in the next 10 years. This is a super big effort, and then going to zero 2050 or somewhere after that. But we are, if you go to the next one, well, 2 degrees, which is not Paris compatible, because Paris says well below 2 degrees. It would be still cutting emissions by 25% from today until 2030. So even that is difficult. But this blue line is where we are really going. This is with current policies, what countries have put in place. They're policies that they have implemented at home. And if they do those and emissions go in that way, and it's uncertain with COVID and everything else, we'll basically be at 3 degrees or 2.9 degrees at the end of the century, which basically means catastrophic climate change. So it is a situation that we definitely have to avoid. That's why we have the Paris Agreement and the pledges and targets that countries have put forward. And on the next one, you see that if we take all of these pledges into account, you can see not too much is happening on the short term, but at least on the long term, some reductions are there. These includes also the long-term pledges that countries have put into the Paris Agreement. So the EU, for example, has a long-term target and submitted all the long-term LTSs that have been submitted. So already going a bit further, 2.6 degrees, much better, but still far away from the 1.5. And then the good news is, and that's for me the good news of last year, that more and more countries are subscribing to net zero. That now includes also China, net zero by 2060, and also US, net zero by 2050. And if you take this very, very positive interpretation, take all the 127 countries that have considered or have adopted net zero targets, so including US, including China, and assume that they really do what they promised, then we go down to 2.1 degrees by the end of the century. So this is really good, much better than before, good news, and is hopeful. These are good long-term intentions. They're very good and are to be commended. But what I'm really worried about is short-term implementation. If we look at here, this little box here, which I'm going to zoom in, you can see the huge gap that we have on the short term. If we are really interested in 1.5 degrees, then, as I said, global emissions need to be halved in the next 10 years. And currently they're more stable, which you see on the next slide, where you will see this cutout, this only period from 1990 to 2030. And here you see this huge gap with all the pledges that were on the table before, well, in September, basically, last year. Emissions are basically stable until 2030, but they have to be cut in half to be in line with 1.5. So there's a huge gap. If you want to say it in gigatons, it's 23 to 27 gigatons of emissions. It's basically we are twice as much emissions as we are allowed to have. Now, what the interesting bit is, what happened now with the summit? We have new pledges. Actually, we have new pledges from the EU already last year, and we have now new pledges from the US. And all of these new updates that have come since September, they reduce this gap by a substantial amount, I would say, around 3 gigatons or 12 to 14%, which is the positive news. The negative news, it's still a large gap. But okay, we have never ever seen such a big jump in just a few days. So this is positive news. So if you look at this little green change, the roughly 3 gigatons, on the next slide, you will see where that comes from. Yeah, so that's the total 3 gigatons reductions that are new. And they come mainly from the US is the biggest contribution. When you compare it to no targets, that's what we are doing here. So under Trump, there was no NDC out of the Paris Agreement. So no target was the baseline here. And the new target is really significantly more ambitious. Then you had the EU, which went from minus 40 to minus 55%. You had China, which made already last year a proposal, a modest proposal, I would say, to increase ambition for 2030. You had Japan is new, UK is also last year, Canada is new, and Ukraine was also last year. This is the positive news. Now what's missing? And what is the negative news? You have, unfortunately, also countries that went backwards. Brazil, for example. It looks like the same, but if you do the numbers, it's less. And you have certain countries that have submitted exactly the same thing. As we've seen, we have this huge gap, and we basically need to flip into emergency mode if we are serious about this. And then the one thing that should not happen is that a country submits exactly the same as before, exactly the same that they've submitted 5 years ago, which include Australia, Mexico, Brazil, and Russia. And other countries, or Indonesia said that they probably will not submit something more ambitious. That's still unclear. And then we have a round of countries that have not said anything from the G20 here, India, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. So what I think, what we've heard is what's really needed now is one, the countries that have made their pledges great, excellent. Even they have to go back and hopefully overachieve them to further narrow the gap. And then the countries that have not made pledges go back and think about what still can be done. Over to you again, Peter.
That's great. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Just so I am sure I've got this straight. So we still need to find about at least 20 gigatons worth of cuts between now and 2030, correct?
Yes, if we want to stay on this pathway towards 1.5.
Right, and
yes.
Given that most of the parties most of the countries that have joined the Paris Agreement don't actually emit anything like 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent, doesn't that mean in a sense that we need even more action perhaps from the big emitters, China, the US, the EU, more than what they've already pledged for 2030? Otherwise, where is it going to come from?
Yeah, first of all, I think we need it from everybody. If you look at what countries have put forward, they are asked to say why their contribution is fair. Yeah, and many said our contribution is fair because we are small. If you add up all the countries that have said our contribution is fair because we are small, you come up to a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the countries that say it's fair because we are small, they make up 25% of global emissions. So that means to me, every country counts. Yeah. So even if you're small, you need to go back and see what you can do. Then I think, yes, the developed countries, we need to cut emissions in half in the next 10 years. None of the developed countries are proposing that from themselves. Maybe UK gets close, but EU is not, US is not. So Japan is definitely not, Canada not. Those countries are not proposing for themselves to cut emissions in half in the next 10 years. And also they then basically have to look at what other things they can do. And the third point is, the developing countries cannot do it alone. And we heard it already, financing is a very important part of the puzzle. Developed countries need to reduce their emissions, but they also significantly need to increase their financing to developing countries. Otherwise, they'll have no chance to go on a pathway that is prescribed here.
Just before I move on to someone else, can you just go back a bit and just explain that? Because, you know, as Alison was explaining, the UK is saying it's going to be cutting emissions 78% by 2035, which sounds as though it's going to be in the ballpark, at least, of cutting emissions in half in the next 10 years. But I guess it's the baseline that matters. Is that right?
Exactly. I'm always speaking about from today. And many of the targets are from 1990 for the EU and for the UK. That's where the emissions were the highest. For the US, it's from 2005, also the point where they were the highest. So you always have to calculate how far have they reduced from their respective base year until today, and then from today onwards, a certain level. Definitely, I think the EU and UK have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions significantly in the past 30 years, which is a very good thing and helps now others to do more. But I'm simplifying by saying, okay, if we just simply look at where do people go from today in the next 10 years, then it's more complicated. But as I said, I think the UK is probably the only one that is meeting that kind of a benchmark.
Yeah, yeah. And just one more question before I let you go, and we've discussed this actually in the past, and you'll be very bored when I ask you this again, but a lot of people watching, of course, read with great interest the 2018 IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, which said that to have any hope of stopping temperatures rising above 1.5 degrees, as you mentioned, emissions have to come down by around 45% by 2030 from 2010 levels. Now, where are we at in terms of that 45% number now in the wake of the Biden summit?
Yeah, well, if you compare it to the 45, I mean, we have done 5 maybe of those, 5 to 10.
Okay, yeah. So, oh, well, I mean, if it's 10%, then that means that we're, instead of a 45% cut, that if everything's implemented, we could be looking at a 35% cut, is that?
That's the maximum, indeed, yes.
Right, so that's encouraging.
It is encouraging, and I really want to say half full, half empty. No, I'm doing this for 20 years almost, and never we were able to get anywhere close to 2 or 1.5 degrees. And now, for the very first time, we at least see it somewhere in the horizon with the ambition that countries put on the table. So I'm more hopeful than I've ever been. And also this big step with the Biden summit, it was remarkable to get all these countries on board. It is like countries like Japan. Japan had submitted a target. It has now submitted a better one just a few months later. That is a very good result out of this positive spiral that has been created. So that's why I'm more hopeful than ever, although the task is big, but we can still do it.
Yeah. Li Shuo and Monica, I just want to ask you, realistic, Li Shuo, you first of all, do you think that we are likely to see another major commitment from Beijing in terms of near-term, i.e. a climate pledge between now and 2030 that's going to make a meaningful difference? I mean, in other words, are we going to be able to see anything like the contribution that Nicholas is talking about still being needed?
Well, I guess we have no other choice, right? We do need further ambition from major economies. I think from the Chinese perspective, if I look at the political, diplomatic, and economic conditions for further ambition, we are actually at a much better place than a few years ago. Talking about economic conditions, building new coal-fired power plant, right? We're burning more coal simply does not make economic sense anymore in China. If you build more coal-fired power plant, you're going to burn money, not coal, right? So I think a very compelling economic argument can be built now in a much more stronger way than a few years ago. And I think the second point here is if Nicholas was looking at the glass half full. Please also allow me to look at the glass half empty, which is we cannot afford just simply assuming all the targets that are put on paper will be delivered in practice. There is still a lot of work to do simply to deliver what has been committed. And going forward post April 22nd, I'd also see that as a major area for further work. Particularly among the major powers. They need to look at each other and ensure that what they have promised are indeed enforced. Yeah, and just before I go to Monica, what about the fact that unlike in 2014 and 2015 in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, the situation now, the relationship now between the US and China is quite scratchy. And in fact, I've heard you on previous panels say that if anything, it's more akin to the lead up to the 2009 Copenhagen climate summit, which, as we know, was not covered in glory. Sorry, Richard, I know that brings back harsh memories, but it's that's probably, well, you thought that was probably closer to where we were now. Now that was before the Biden summit. Do you still think that we're not going to be able to see the sort of close collaboration that we saw between the US and China that helped to make the Paris Agreement actually happen? Well, look, I think the first thing that I'll say is me as someone based in China, our US counterparts, but also the rest of the world need to realize that there is only an effective climate solution if the major powers are aligned, right, on this particular agenda. We've seen how that really helped us in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. So we really need to find a way for this to work. And I think in the context of that, I do see the recent joint statement between the US and China delivered in Shanghai as a concrete step forward. I think, again, post April 22nd, there needs to be a lot of follow-up work, right, to further firm up this cooperation so that more and more political trust can be built. But with that said, I don't think we should be political naive, right? For colleagues that are not familiar with where the US-China overall bilateral relationship is at the moment, it is in a pretty bad shape, right? So we cannot guarantee that the climate agenda will be fully vaccinated from the more toxic overall bilateral relationship. So we need to be prepared about that. We shouldn't be naive that we can somehow go back to the Paris time. And we need to be prepared and think about how, in this more complicated and delicate geopolitical environment, the climate agenda can still be progressed. And that's where, that's why, the G7, G20 putting climate firmly on some of the subsequent multilateral, high political moments is very, very critical.
Yeah. Monica, can you respond to that? I mean, is that pretty much the view from Washington as well, that it's going to be quite a climb back still to get anywhere near the position that you were ahead of the Paris Agreement when it comes to relations with China on climate change?
I want to go back actually to something you said or the question you initially posed to Li Shuo regarding how we actually get to these big 20, 30, 45% emission reduction. And one of the things that has been sort of ubiquitous in all of the comments today is an assumption that technology, innovation, and deployment is remaining at the level that we're currently seeing. And what we've seen time and time again is an acceleration and also exceeding expectations. Every time the IEA released their reports on what renewable deployment would look like, we have beat it. And so I think one of the reasons that we also remain hopeful is because the markets are moving that way, because innovation is moving that way, and because if we put the investment in research and development to drive that innovation, we can get there. And so I just want to reinforce, we truly believe we can do this. And I think that combined with all of these other lovely participants on the panel through cooperation, through acting together, both developing countries and developed major economies, we can absolutely deliver what's needed to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. On the point regarding cooperation, I think the joint statement is evidence that climate change remains a standalone issue in the relationship between China and the US. And we are committed to working with them to fulfill all the work that was laid out in that statement. And we look forward to doing that. But we also look forward to doing that with every other country that came to the summit. And so we know that the road to Glasgow is 6 months, and we're not even in a sprint, we're in a marathon, right? It's a marathon, and we have a lot of work to do to continue to work with everyone so that all targets aren't just targets, they are implemented. And so that is where our objective is going forward.
Yeah, thanks for that. Richard, can I just bring you in? You've had so much experience. All of this conversation is obviously incredibly familiar to you from your many years at the UNFCCC. What do you think is going to be the main hurdle now? If you were back in Bonn and it was up to you now to be thinking about how these pledges should really be implemented and accelerated, what would your advice be?
Well, I have to say, after long experience viewing often with optimism these pledges coming in, one can only be disappointed that 30 years after the Framework Convention was agreed, we're still in such a bad situation. So the points that a couple of the colleagues have made about the importance of implementation, to me, is absolutely critical. And this means really keeping the pressure on governments to do, I think Monica's point about technology is really important. So there's a role for business and the economic actors to move that forward, but also for government to drive and legislate and require change. It won't just happen out of the goodness of people's hearts. And one of the things actually that I was really struck by and encouraged by from the summit and the Biden administration approach is the emphasis that they have put on all of government. For so many years, climate has been stuck in climate ministries or in environment ministries and hasn't really budged very far. Occasionally it pops up onto the table of the heads of government, and then it disappears, and you get a wave of progress. But we really need to follow the example that President Biden is now delivering in Washington by making all of his cabinet secretaries active and committed to move on climate change. And this needs to be the case in all governments, not just in a few. A few do it, but not very many. And that, to me, once you get the transport ministries and the energy ministries, who often are resisting things rather than promoting them, and the industry ministries, once these people, these ministers and their whole teams can drive that agenda forward, we'll have a much better chance to hit the kind of benchmarks that Nicholas has been speaking about.
Yeah, it's a super interesting point. Jennifer, I want to go to you because when you look at what the EU is doing, it's obviously been a huge environmental policy leader for many, many years. But Richard's right, really, that it hasn't actually managed to bring that whole of government, or the sense that it's brought a whole of government approach to climate yet. Is that, would you agree with that, or do you think that that's an unfair characterization?
I think it's potentially an overgeneralization. The EU isn't a homogenous entity, and I think that we've certainly seen the European Green Deal bring a bit more of a whole of government approach to the Commission and the European institutions approaches. But then when you look country to country, it varies drastically. So this is an issue. But I do still think that the EU is world leading in anchoring its pledges and its targets in policy, in things like the climate law, and they really do have a good story to tell there and offer a lot of technical assistance to the world. But the one piece that I'm still missing here, and Nicholas did mention it, is good policies aren't going to change the fact that the vast majority of the world is facing a fiscal crisis, and aren't going to change the fact that the vast majority of the world quite simply don't have the money to invest in the transitions that would allow them to set higher targets that could then be anchored in policy propositions. And so while I do think that the governance and the policy processes are incredibly important, they aren't going to be what closes the gap this year. And really looking at where can investment in green recovery not just be a luxury for the G7, but actually be unlocked for other parties in such a way that they can still even consider setting higher targets ahead of COP26. I think that's the real question over the next 6 months, over the next 3 months, between now, the G7 summit, the Franco-Africa summit, the G20 Venice summit. These are the real questions, because if we don't get that big money shifted, then the 100 billion and delivery on a bit of climate adaptation finance, as necessary as it is, isn't actually going to shift the pathway that we're seeing over the next decade. And I think we're seeing a lot of that reflected in the questions in the comments as well. So I think really alignment on unlocking development finance flows, unlocking SDR reallocation and recycling. We've already seen some shifts there. SDR is kind of the geeky term for special drawing rights from the IMF as kind of the lender of last resort, but really actually just giving some of these governments the fiscal headspace to make any sort of decision. And that doesn't just go for lower income countries, that is also the case for parts of the G20. And I think that's the next step that we really need to be focusing on. The one thing that this summit didn't show is an alliance building behind unlocking that money for green recoveries elsewhere. And that's what really concerns me. The final thing that I'd just like to say on this is, Paris wasn't a G2 stitch-up. Paris happened because there was a broad coalition of actors behind it, including vulnerable countries that worked together with the EU, together with the UK, to build a rules-based system around that G2 compromise. And we're not going to see that emerge as long as vulnerable countries are struggling to even get vaccinated, to even invest in anything, to see any form of solidarity or multilateral systems delivering for them. So I would caution us in thinking that just looking at that relationship between the US and China is going to give us any measure of success at COP. It's an incredibly important factor, but that alliance building, whether that works or doesn't over the next 6 months, that's going to make or break COP26.
Yeah,
and the EU and the UK are big factors in that. Thank you.
And when you refer to the $100 billion, that's the $100 billion a year that wealthier countries said would be mobilized. By now, it hasn't been. Obviously, we've had a pandemic. But can you just tell us where we're up to really when it comes to that pledge in the UN negotiations or the UN discussions?
I'm not best placed on this panel. I think others might be. The thing that I would point to is that when we talk about green recovery, we're not talking about 100 billion, we're talking about literal trillions. Yeah. So I do think we need to think in different sums of money if we're actually thinking about shaping the next decade. And it is an incredibly important commitment that was made. And therefore there is value in fulfilling it, both monetary and diplomatic, in terms of trust in the system. But the actual money that we need is more in the kind of 1 to 2.5 trillion ballpark, and this is very much a ballpark figure.
Yeah, actually, we do have an answer from one of our very well-informed audience members saying that we're around 70 billion at the moment, which is not 100 billion. We've got a lot of interesting questions. some of them relate to a question I'm going to put to Alison now. Alison, we are, as you said, just 6 months away from the November COP. And we have India in crisis. We have a number of European countries even still with quite severe COVID restrictions. Vaccinations clearly are not being spread and not being rolled out equally around the world. Isn't it really just going to be impossible to have anything approaching what we would all regard as a normal COP meeting in November in Glasgow?
No, I mean, I think a normal COP meeting, I think, you know, it's a stretch to imagine, you know, exactly as we've seen it in previous years. But you know, I think, yes, that there are other crises happening in the world. And I think, you know, we all know how difficult that has been, especially in India right now, and then for pretty much every country around the world. But just to flip that question slightly, you know, I think you can't put one crisis on hold in order to solve another, especially when they're not, you know, the response to one can help another. So I think we've seen, you know, a lot of talk about the green recovery, and we need to make sure the kind of COVID recovery teaches, you know, we learn lessons from what has happened through the COVID crisis in terms of our resilience, in terms of sustainability, in terms of how we are treating our planet. And we use that to put the world on a much more sustainable footing. So I think, you know, these two crises are coming to a head at the same time. And it's equally, you know, it's important that we deal with them both. And, you know, I think we've seen from, you know, we are here today to talk about the US summit last week with President Biden, as you said, you know, brought 40 world leaders, including 17 of the major economies who prioritized and put their time towards this issue, because I think they recognize that it is a crisis that does need to be dealt with, and that we can't, you know, put on hold. We obviously had to delay COP for 1 year last year. You know, I think both the Prime Minister and the COP President have been clear that we're working towards an in-person meeting in November. And that, you know, I think the Prime Minister last week, he called on world leaders, you know, to come with ambition. I think it's a consistent message that we need the political will to tackle this issue, and that we can't completely dissociate it from everything else that is happening in the world and in our economy. So no, I think in some respects, obviously, in terms of the restrictions that are in place, that makes things difficult. But in terms of what we are seeing now in political will, I think Nicholas said it was, you know, the biggest step forward he's seen this year. And in this year where we're having a COVID crisis, I think that shows that the seriousness and the urgency with which this is now being dealt. So I guess it depends how you categorize a normal COP.
Well, when I say normal COP, I mean, obviously, I mean an enormous event with thousands and thousands of people, not just the negotiators from the negotiating teams from each country, which, by the way, can add up easily. I think I'm right in saying this, Richard and Yusuf will correct me, but you could easily get around 2,000 people just in the negotiating teams alone. And then, of course, you've got all of the people who typically come, everyone from NGOs to Fortune 500 companies, everybody on the outside doing all of having their events and putting pressure on the negotiators inside in many cases. That surely can't go ahead, right? I mean, you could have the leaders coming, you could have the negotiators, but surely there can't be any room for what is known in the trade as civil society to be meeting in the way that they normally would.
Well, I mean, the team is doing a lot of work, you know, with public health officials, with the Scottish Government, with all of our partners, and with the UNFCCC, and we're looking at how we can have an in-person event that, you know, obviously prioritises health of individuals, and also, I think, really crucially enables delegates to participate on an equal footing. You know, and we have heard very clearly from a number of countries that the negotiations need to be in person. We're obviously also looking at how we can use technology and some of the best practice that's coming through from events like this. I think we're all much more used to doing virtual events now to make the summit as inclusive as possible. But I think, you know, the team are in the stage of looking at all the scenarios and working through that. But yeah, we are very clearly planning for an in-person event, whilst looking at, you know, how technology can be used to ensure that all of the other activity that goes on, as you say, around a normal COP, can take place in some shape or form.
Yeah, we have quite a lot of questions building up, and I am going to get to them very quickly. But Yusuf, I just want to ask you, because the UNFCCC, UN Climate, as it's now called, the UN Climate Secretariat, is actually organising a big meeting in June that's going to go for 3 weeks, a preparatory meeting ahead of COP. Now, normally these things only go for about 2 weeks. I understand that you've had to make it go for 3 weeks just because when you put these things online, it's incredibly difficult and it takes that long. I also understand it's going to be really difficult for a lot of people from a lot of countries to take part. And I just wonder, can you explain to us what are some of the logistical changes that you've had to make this meeting work, because it may well be that they end up influencing what happens in Glasgow, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in terms of the June session, the reason it's 3 weeks is because we have to confine the number of hours per day to probably 3 hours in order to accommodate as many time zones as possible. And with that, we still have to rotate time zones to enable sort of equal pay across the world, across the 3 weeks. Now, I mean, the COVID crisis, and one of the questions referred to this, it offers us challenges, but perhaps opportunities. I mean, we have been able to conduct throughout the year a lot of virtual meetings. There has been easier access to ministers, to heads of state, even they don't have to fly in order to attend the meeting. And so if we capitalize fully on this opportunity, and speaking about the COP, it might not have as many people in person, but it could end up being the biggest COP in history if we manage the hybrid solution well and be as inclusive as possible so those who aren't there can participate. So right now we're improving in handling the notion of virtual negotiations, and the June session, even though it's labeled as the subsidiary body sessions, still all the negotiations or deliberations will be conducted informally. So no final decision making will be taken until the parties can meet in person in Glasgow. And so, I mean, thinking of the opportunities, one and the parallels between the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, I can't help but recall the proverbial frog in the boiling water. So when you throw the frog in water that's already boiled, it jumps out. That's what's happening with COVID. We're confronted with it. Everyone is immediately responding. Massive amounts of money are being put there. But when the water is boiling slowly, even though the end result may be the same or worse, then the sense of urgency is a bit different. And so as we move between here and Glasgow, there's obviously that half empty portion of the glass that Nicholas was talking about. And how does one then bridge that gap? It would not be a great outcome if we reach there and the numbers are still showing a massive gap. And between now and then, if governments are close to the end of their capacity for what they're willing to pledge, as Richard said, there are a lot of other actors, and we have a climate action stream that tries to address all kinds of different players in the field. And there's one of the questions that mentioned corporations. And certainly there are industries that need to be addressed. I mean, concrete and steel. And note that, I mean, we just read somewhere that the top 1% are emitting as much as the bottom 50%. The world has 2,755 billionaires whose net worth is $13 trillion. By comparison, the GDP of the US is 21 trillion and of China is 14. So we need to be starting to address players in addition to governments in order to push that ambition train further. And through our platforms between now and the end of the year, I think we should maximize the mobilization of these efforts, including in the ministerial and heads of state events that are coming up to push for other players. It's not just governments, but everybody. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that great point. Now I know Jennifer unfortunately has to leave for another meeting, but Jennifer, just before you go, just tell us: are you booked into a hotel in Glasgow somewhere?
I'm not, but I'm really hoping that there might be some friendly civil society crowd surfing. But I would just leave with a challenge that civil society is not periphery at these meetings. That doesn't count for all civil society, but there is a very important function. And while I agree that virtual events have seen an opening up of participation from a variety of government stakeholders, it has held a lot of pitfalls for civil society participation in the form that we usually benefit from in the form of COPs, which is informal coffees with negotiators, being able to grab somebody on the way out of the room just to clarify what is going on, as well as just the space for bilateral consultations. And I would not underestimate how important that is in the way that we work into the process and the way that we try to enable accountability and transparency within the process, but also quite honestly in the way that we help translate the process and kind of pass it into our local communities, into our local governments, into our media landscapes. So civil society at COPs is not just side events. There is a function that we try to fill to really make sure that this is a process that gets the maximum amount out of it for the planet and the people that we represent. And therefore we ask that we are not peripheral in the considerations of how you enable our participation. I'm hoping that Leisha and Nicholas Turner and my interventions on this panel have proved what we bring to the process. So a little pitch as I leave, and great apologies to this fantastic panel. I would love to listen to more of this conversation. Thank you so much to folks for convening this, and thank you to you, so Polita.
Well, thanks so much, Jennifer. Well, I guess Alison and Yusuf heard that loud and clear, and I'm pretty sure it's probably not for the first time. I just want to go to some of the questions that have been coming in here. Nicholas, there's one in particular for you, saying that you make the important point that to achieve the 1.5 degree target, we need to halve emissions in 10 years. But central to that is the energy transition. And what's actually your sense that the global energy architecture is really on the right path at the moment when it comes to making such an enormous transition?
Yeah, I think we mentioned it before that renewable energy technologies, for example, they surprise us every year in how fast costs are reduced just by the sheer mass of it. So now, 5 years after Paris, the world is completely different, and our view of the future energy system is completely different than it was 5 years ago. We know the renewables have become much more cheap, and we can do complete different things. Renewables, storage, electric mobility, all of that is very different to what we thought 5 years ago. And that for me is one point that actually now all countries that made a commitment 5 years ago, it's outdated. You basically have to review it, and you can do more than you did before. And Monica was saying she's hopeful that we can do it, and I'm equally hopeful. We have all the tools, we have the technology how to do it. It's more the society or more how decisions are made. I think we are investing a lot into renewables, but other parts of society are also investing a lot in coal-fired power plants. And Lucio was saying they're investing, in burning money, not burning coal. I think all of the coal-fired power plants that are built today will never, ever run economically until the end of their life. It's simply impossible. It will not work. So every investor has to really think whether it's a good idea to build a coal-fired power plant today, anywhere in the world, actually. I think it doesn't work. What
about a new thermal coal mine?
Same thing.
In Cumbria, for example.
Coal is on the downward path. I would even say investing in new gas infrastructure anywhere is not a good idea. We have like solar with storage is in many places of the world cheaper than building a new gas-fired turbine. I think these kinds of investments are not a good idea.
Yeah, Alison, I mean, I'm not meaning to be too facetious about Cumbrian coal mines, but obviously it must have complicated your job earlier this year when these plans for a new coal mine in Cumbria were on the table. They're not quite as rigidly on the table as they were now, but at the same time, there's also been a plan put on the table that still is there very much, which is to cut international aid, overseas aid. The UK is saying that climate finance is still going to be a priority. But surely this is a problem when you're trying to encourage countries around the world to contribute more finance and cut emissions? If the UK is still doing this, is it still a problem for you?
Well, I think if you look at the big picture of what we're doing in the UK, you know, the first country to put net zero into law, you know, we came out with our ambitious NDC of 8% by 2030. We've gone further to make a 2035 commitment in law for 78% reductions. Our coal use is reduced 40% between 2012 and 2019. It's now 2% of our energy mix from what was, you know, a very coal dependent country in the past. And on the finance side, you know, we have come out and said we will spend 11.6 billion on climate finance to the period of 2025. So, you know, and that commitment stands amidst the ODA cut. So, you know, there is a lot that we are doing as the UK to show a direction of travel and to show leadership. And I think, you know, that's where we're focusing our efforts and certainly encouraging others to also do the same.
Yeah, yeah. And when it comes to the UK's objectives for COP26, what are your main objectives? The top one or two, if you can just spell them out for us. What is that you really, really want to achieve from this meeting?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you 4 instead of 1 or 2, because we have 4 very clear goals for COP26. You know, I mean, the first thing to say is, you know, we are being very clear as COP president that we want to see a high ambition outcome at Glasgow that delivers an urgent response to some of the ambition gaps that we've been talking about today. So that's 1.5 degrees, it's on adaptation, and it's on finance, and particularly the delivery of the 100 billion. So within that, we've got 4 goals. So on mitigation, you know, we need to leave Glasgow with 1.5 in reach. I think we've heard, you know, talk of the decisive decade. I think we all know what needs to be done, and we're calling for all countries to come forward with ambitious 2030 targets, their NDCs, you know, aligned with 1.5, and long-term strategies to reach net zero. So I think that's clear. I think secondly, on adaptation, we need a step change here on a number of levels. It needs to be a lot more central to countries' planning. We need countries to come forward with their adaptation plans to the UNFCCC, and we really need donors to scale up adaptation finance, so countries are supported in doing that. I think third goal on finance, you know, we really need donor countries to drive and evidence progress on the 100 billion and show that finance, both public and private, is flowing. And we need to begin discussions as well on the post-2025 framework. And it's not just about the quantum of finance, you know, we need to also address issues of access and quality. And we need, like, the IFIs to be also aligning their portfolios with Paris. And then finally, and this has come up, I think, a few times in this conversation, but the fourth goal is around collaboration. You know, this is something that we all have to do together. I think the strength of Paris is its kind of universality, and we need to deliver on our negotiating mandates. We need to finalise the Paris rulebook, and things that give countries confidence that, again, as we said before, these targets will be implemented, reported on, accounted for. And we're also using our presidency to enhance collaboration and push for transformational change in some of the sectors that we've been talking about today. So, you know, we've heard about coal, the need to kind of fade out coal. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on clean energy, on clean transport, and on nature. So sorry, that was 4 instead of 1 or 2, but I think in a nutshell, that's what we're aiming for.
No, that's it's a very understandable list, and it's a fine set of objectives. I'm actually thinking of now of a paper that Richard co-authored a little while ago with other former leaders from the UNFCCC, which talked about the fact that the UN climate process itself was previously well ahead of public consciousness on climate change, but actually had come to lag it. In other words, public sentiment and, in fact, anger and, in fact, activism, as we've seen with Greta Thunberg and students, and, in fact, a whole range of other actors who've been really coming to the fore in the last year or so, last couple of years. You know, they're kind of demanding more of the UN process, then the UN process itself, in some ways, I would argue, is basically set up to deliver. Is that fair, do you think, Richard? And do you think that you've seen any signs of change since your paper was published?
I think for me, it's really important to have a sense of what a COP can do. It was very good to hear from Alison the objectives of the UK presidency. But if you roll that back to think about sort of concrete outcomes from a COP, the first that you could get is a treaty. Well, we're not going to get, there's no expectation of a treaty from Glasgow. The second is COP decisions, basically where you have consensus amongst all governments that they're going to decide something and do it. And here, I think Alison mentioned, we must finish the rule book to implement the Paris Agreement. There's transparency measures that need to be agreed and adopted. That's really important homework that can be done in a negotiation process. For me, what's critical is, will it be possible to deliver consensus COP decisions that entrench 2030 and 2050 as landmark or milestone outcomes? That will be a real measure of the achievement of Glasgow if that can be done. But the other thing about a COP is that there's all sorts of things that are important about COPs that have nothing to do with the decision-making process or the formal negotiations. And a number of the colleagues today have referred to the civil society aspects, the mobilization around COPs, these events that happen on the side, and all of that contributes to give a sense that something is happening, that we have a momentum growing and that we've reached a turning point. And to me, this will be the critical thing, especially in a COVID time, to try to orchestrate that COP26 will give that sense that we have turned a corner and we're on our way to a different place. Now, the negotiators are struggling I think in times when there isn't head of state engagement. It's really hard for negotiators to get attention. So the fact that we are now in an era when you have heads of state engagement means, I think, that there's a better chance of success. Similarly, with the business community also coming in and the finance sector in particular coming in, I think that also is a very positive element. And for me, one of the real things to keep an eye on is, will it be possible for the UK and for others to generate these kind of coalitions of the willing around touchstone issues where you don't need 190 countries to agree on an outcome, you really need the major players to agree. Things like, I mean, it's really scandalous that what is happening on coal in the world today. It's absolutely scandalous. And would it be possible to have even some sort of side arrangement that would take us another step forward on coal, or fossil fuel subsidies, or carbon pricing? These have all been kicked around on the sidelines for a long time. This is a moment when we can do something decisive. And I really hope that the presidency, with its allies at major countries like the United States, but working with all Jennifer made the point that Paris was a success because it was a conference of coalitions of every interested group and country. So that to me would be a really essential thing to keep in mind, and to give the process a chance to succeed because of all the buy-in, momentum, and engagement, and not let inertia and vested interests hold things back.
Yeah. Just by the way, everybody, Joanna de Pledge has just kindly posted a link to the paper that Richard co-authored in the chat there, which I do recommend. But let me ask, I mean, Alison and Yousef, from where you sit, how realistic, and actually Monica and Lisho, I'd like to ask you as well, but how realistic is it, do you think, that the sorts of measures that Richard just mentioned could in fact somehow become part of the process? Alison, you first. I mean, can you see some way perhaps of pushing to get some sort of agreement on an end to fossil fuel subsidies, which people have been talking about? I don't know how long it's been, well over a decade. It's actually, even the G20, I think, was probably more than a decade now since they said they were going to to wind them all up. And of course, they're still not. Can you imagine that it might be possible to inject that into the process?
Well, I mean, I said before that we need to leave Glasgow showing that we are responding to the gaps that we know are in front of us on mitigation, on adaptation and finance. So, you know, I think, you know, we do need to be looking at high ambition outcomes from Glasgow that do that. I think, you know, we obviously as the COP presidency, we are not the decision maker. We are the ones that are bringing countries together to get to these outcomes and these solutions, and I think, you know, the collaboration point and that, you know, every country needs to be involved in this process, that they're very important points, and we need to facilitate that. I think, you know, now we've got the session in June that Yousef was talking about, where finally, you know, we can get parties to discuss these issues, even if in a virtual setting. And I think that's going to give us some sense of direction of where the discussion is going. And, you know, the COP president has been really clear that he plans to convene ministers, you know, as well. He's been doing a lot of obviously traveling and bilateral meetings, but it's also important that ministers can meet in a multilateral setting. And then we have a set of, you know, leader level events towards COP26 as well that we need to utilize. So you know, we continue to believe, and I think we have to believe that ambition is possible from Glasgow, and it's not only possible, it's vital. And so I think as COP presidency, we will keep working to facilitate that, and I'm sure Yousef has views as well.
Yousef, what's your view? I mean, just logistically, how does that happen? Yeah.
Totally agree, and I mean, I think Richard alluded to a very important point, which is that not everything arises from the rigorous negotiating process, but also from the parallel process. Just rewinding a bit, when the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, the rhythm that was set for the negotiations planned for the first political moment where we assess ambition to happen in 2023, the first global stocktake. In the meantime, in 2018 and 2019, we got alarm calls from the science, from the IPCC in the 1.5 report, and the IPBES report in 2019. And those, I think, created that switching gear of public consciousness that you were talking about. And we saw that reflected very strongly in Madrid when civil society was extremely vocal at the slow pace of ambition, which was not on the agenda of negotiations. And in Glasgow, there is no item to assess the NDCs or the synthesis report. It is supposed to be produced, but there's no negotiation on it. But then, so that parallel process would be really important for ambition, whether it results in the form of a declaration from heads of state or otherwise, to give that push for ambition. So yes, there will be negotiations on things like completing the rule book, on transparency, on Article 6, but that part on ambition, on mitigation, on adaptation and finance, a lot of it will happen in parallel and will be empowered by strong statements by the leaders. It may be reflected in the overarching decision, which is one CP26 in a sentence or two, but the thrust will not come from a protracted negotiation, but rather from the efforts of leaders between now and then, and the culmination of that in public statements that will lead to some political commitment of the type you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Li Shuo, I know, I'm just conscious of the time where it is, where you are at the moment. I just wonder, you know, if there were a push to say, you know, get some sort of process for agreement on carbon pricing, and I'm not talking about Article 6 itself, which is it's like, if there was some sort of push to get some sort of agreement on carbon pricing beyond what's being talked about in Article 6, China is apparently about to finally launch its ETS, it's an emissions trading scheme nationally, but it's not quite there yet, I think. You know, what do you think its response would be? And Monica, same question to you after Li Shuo has spoken.
Well, no, I think China should certainly support that approach. I mean, carbon price, that's what the country has been working on for the past decade. I mean, making kind of baby steps over the past few years. But you know, this year, you know, the pilot ETS system will be expanded nationwide. We still need to tighten the cap, and we we also need to broaden the coverage of our carbon pricing system to not only the power sector, but also increasingly the heavy industries. So I do hope that China could play a supportive role, but also, you know, in the context of COP26, I do agree that there seems to be kind of two baskets of issues, right? The ones that would require multilateral deliberation, that is, you know, going to be delivered by the COP decision, and on the other hand, another basket on kind of real world ambition, what you will do, right, domestically to cut emissions or to provide finance. I do also, of course, see a very important role for China in both of these two baskets. I think on a formal finalizing the Paris rulebook, the key thing for China there is how to interpret CBDR and how this will be reflected in the Paris spirit.
But differentiated responsibilities. Oh, I thought my brain was
right.
We're going to be able to pronounce that again, but there we are. Just managed.
There you go.
Which time in these negotiations, yes.
Yeah, that's you know, primarily about, you know, what different more common responsibilities developing and developed countries should take. There we certainly need some leadership from the Chinese side,
yeah,
to deliver the rule book in the true spirit of the Paris Agreement. And then of course on the real world ambition side, you know, further progress in coal. As I said, the conditions are getting mature. It is in China's interest, and to do so will ultimately help China to you know, fulfill the 2030 peaking and the 2060 carbon neutrality goals.
Yeah. And Monica, carbon pricing was not included in the White House statement last week. Some people think that was, you know, a problem. And I'm going to ask Nicholas next whether he thinks that scientifically speaking it is. But from your perspective, how do you think we can really realistically expect to see the administration embrace the idea of pushing for carbon pricing in this first term of Mr. Biden's?
Yeah, I think, you know, there were a lot of expectations for exactly everything we could accomplish in 100 days. And I'm quite proud of everything that we have set forward already. I would say that similar to Li Shuo's comments, that we are predominantly focused on finishing the Paris rulebook and finalizing that joint understanding of how carbon markets are going to work. I also want to come back to your initial question that sort of kicked this off regarding participation in the COP, and the fact that the COP is sort of rigid in form, right? There's a set agenda, there's a set of stakeholders that are all engaged. And one of the things that we learned in the United States over the last 4 years is how critical it is to have cities, to have governors, and to have other non-state actors involved, because they are the large reason how we are going to meet a lot of our emissions reduction target. And we need to make sure that we're not just engaging at the COP, but also participating in these other fora to make sure that their work is moving forward, that they have the right support that they need as well. And so it's not just youth, it's also the mayors, it's also indigenous stakeholders, it's everyone. And going back to that all of government response, it's an all of society response. And I think that's also part of our work moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you. And Nicholas, how important do you think it is, or how much would it shift the dial that you are constantly monitoring when it comes to reaching the Paris temperature goals, if there could be some sort of greater agreement on, say, carbon pricing, or indeed an end to fossil fuel subsidies, or a rapid phase out of coal? What's the most important?
Yeah, I think I mentioned before that we are in an emergency situation, and there's no single measure which can do the trick. We have to do everything, and we have to try everything. The great thing about ending fossil fuel subsidies and carbon pricing is that you generate new revenues that you can then use to even accelerate the transition. I think that's the main positive element of the carbon price, but it alone will not do the trick. But it is an important piece of the puzzle. I think what I've shown before is this huge emissions gap which we still have. what you can also do, and we try to do that as one of the UNEP emissions gap reports, to measure other things, other areas where critical mass has been achieved. So how many countries do have ambitious carbon pricing, for example, or how many countries or even companies, cities and regions, how many of them have net zero targets? I think for net zero targets, we have reached critical mass. It's 2/3 of global emissions are covered already. Great, ticked off. But how many countries have 100% renewable targets, or cities, regions and companies? Not that many, but quite a bit. How many have 100% electric vehicle targets? For when? That group is increasing very, very fast. But you can also count how many countries have said that they will stop extracting oil, for example. Not many. Denmark is the biggest one so far. Or how many have said and achieved ending fossil fuel subsidies, or emission-free steel, or to zero emission flying. In all of them, you find a few players now that have this ambitious goals. But I think that's the thing. If the COP and this whole process can incentivize groups around these different topics, and we see these groups are growing, and they're growing so fast that they have critical mass. And once they have critical mass, then, well, the whole global system flips. But that's the many things that we have to look at.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, isn't it? I'm not sure that many people have really focused on what Denmark did. I think I think I'm correct in saying that it basically said that it was not going to allow new contracts for drilling oil that the industry was expecting. And, you know, quite a difficult decision to make. I don't think you probably can tell us more about what happened as a result than I can, but it didn't go down that well uniformly in all quarters, correct?
No, not easy at all. But that's the whole transition is very, very difficult, and you have to really be careful to do it and to compensate those that lose the most. This idea of just transition, and again, they're having a carbon price and getting money in that helps to then redistribute that money. But these, I think we have to face it. If we are serious about 1.5, we need to end oil extraction. We need to end coal, and we need to do something to the communities that are most suffering from that transition. That's very clear, but that's a challenge that we have.
Yeah, and I mean we're just at the very beginning of what I think is going to be really a sort of a crunch period where countries and companies have to actually meet their net zero targets. I mean, we had a very interesting story in this morning's paper about the fact that because the EU carbon price has risen so much over the last year, it's about double what it was before the pandemic. It's putting a lot of pressure on European industry, who now really are keen for this plan for carbon border taxes to come to fruition pretty quickly. But of course, those carbon border taxes, as you have all, or several of you have mentioned today, they're going to be really tricky. So these are the sorts of policies that, you know, this is the sort of time that we're going to be starting to see much more difficult politics coming forward. There's time just to answer one question on this very point here, about how we can hold non-state actors accountable. In other words, not countries so much as the companies. The companies don't have to put in anything like a nationally determined contribution in anything like a Paris Agreement process, but they're making some very big announcements. Is there any way, realistically, that they can be held to account other than by the public, the media, and outside sources? Nicholas, what do you think?
Yeah, first of all, I think there's a lot ongoing on non-state actors, so cities, regions, and businesses, which is very encouraging. There's a lot of ambition in that group of actors, often going beyond the ambition of national governments. So if one can create this positive, virtuous cycle between these cities, regions, and companies saying, this is what we want to do, helping the national governments or the governments to do more, and then they positively go in the right way, that would be the right interaction. Holding them 100% accountable is the same issue with holding national governments accountable. We have to do it as a civil society, as research, coming back to it. We, for example, have a project looking at how these non-state actors are doing. That's coming out in June. And you can have a look there on how commitments from regions, cities, and businesses what are they and have they been implemented in the past? So that's something that I think the research and civil society community has to have a good eye on. Otherwise, it will just be greenwashing, which is not a good thing.
All right, I would love to keep talking. It's been such an interesting discussion. Thank you all from me for making some incredibly revealing and interesting points. I'm not sure now what to do about my Glasgow hotel booking, but I am very much hoping I'll be seeing as many of you there as possible. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Richard just to sum up and say goodbye to everyone. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Polita, for really your excellent questions, challenging questions, but also for steering the discussion in a way that brought out so many really interesting questions and dilemmas that the policy community, governments, and others need to address. It really showed the richness of the debate and the diversity of opinions, I think, to a certain extent. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your contribution. To all the panelists, thank you for being here today for 90 minutes. I know you're all very busy, and for bringing insightful and thoughtful, reflective comments and discussion to what was really, I thought, an excellent overview of the issues. And I hope in some small way that this effort by FOGS can contribute to the ongoing policy discussions and drive us towards a more ambitious climate outcome. I will say just a quick word of thanks to my colleagues in FOGS for working behind the scenes diligently to set this all up, for dealing with the technology, etc. So to Yorgos, Stuart, and Peter, thanks a lot, guys. And finally, just a reminder that if you found the discussion so riveting that you'd like to watch it again, or even better, that you could recommend it to your friends and family, it will be posted, we're hoping, in the great words of the Framework Convention, we aim to post it on our website tomorrow. So at fogs.org or on the FOGS Facebook page, and you could view it there, recommend it, tweet it, and it will live on, and I hope be part of the momentum building towards Glasgow. So with that, at 2 minutes over time, I'll say thank you again, everybody. Thank you to those who joined us online, and I wish you all a good evening and a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Where am I?